Sometimes it's very helpful to have knitting already on the machine when you start your main project. One way to do this is to create a cast-on rag. Do this by first casting on 9 or 10 stitches. I'm working on my new Corona bulky machine. It's a CN9, and I do not think I yet have the movement dampening strip adjusted properly, so there's a tendency for my needles to slide backwards. With that in mind, the double E-wrap is working the best for me, and I have to pull the needles all the way backwards and then reseat the cast on below the needles to get started knitting. Corona knitters, stay tuned because in other videos I'm going to address and solve this problem. On most machines that are working just right, you can absolutely use any cast on at all. It doesn't matter what it looks like. Just get something on the machine. And if you have a Corona behaving like this, only worse, you can actually hang a piece of knitting from any source whatsoever on it. An old swatch from something else will do it. Just get 9 or 10 needles in play. In real life, I would be casting on at the very far left of the needle bed. I'm doing it towards the right-hand end so as to make it easier for you to see. I'm not going to knit the entire long rag. I'll just knit enough for you to get the idea. I set the carriage so the needles will knit back from hold, which makes it easier to proceed. Then knit 2 rows, and after every single pair of rows, we decrease 1 on the left and increase 1 on the right. And it's very important to use the simple increase because that makes a strand of yarn at the edge of the fabric. And although many times we don't love that, that's exactly what we want here. Then we knit 2 more rows, but here after the first row, you can see that my newly placed in work needle did pick up and begin to knit. And as it did so, it made the strand of yarn that we will use later. Right now, I've been using the full fashion decrease on the left, which means moving 2 stitches over 1 needle space, so that the doubled stitch occurs on the new needle 2 from the left. And I've been using the simple increase, which means only placing a new needle into work on the right and allowing it to pick up and knit. Most machines will do that without a problem. If you have difficulty, it's perfectly okay to bring the needles forward and knit the first of every pair of rows back from hold. If you're having trouble knitting off the doubled stitches on the decrease or getting the wrap to form on the newly placed in work needle, knitting back from hold will usually solve those problems. Several variations are possible here, and they all work fine. For example, I've been using the full fashion decrease because I prefer the edge it produces, but in all honesty, the edge doesn't matter very much. So if you'd rather use a single prong decrease, feel free. That's also called a simple decrease. I would generally work all the way to the right-hand edge to make the maximum size of cast-on rag. However, if I do that, I'm going to bump into the camera tripod. So just pretend I'm all the way at the edge and I'm taking the carriage off so you can see what's going on better. It is not something that I would normally actually need to do. If you have enough cast-on rag now, you can just bind off. If you do not, take the stitches that are live, pick them up. Usually you're going to need at least 2 transfer tools or a garter bar or a flat knitting needle. A long slim circular needle works well. But in some way, we need to pick up all the stitches and move them back to the left so we have room to continue decreasing at the left and increasing at the right. If you drop a stitch, as I just did, don't panic. Just fish it out and hang it back. It's no biggie. And then we can continue what we're doing. Here is what the edge looks like right off of the machine. The little strands along the edge that were created by the simple increases are what we're going to use to hang the rag on the machine. Here is a rag that has been used one time only. Already the little strands are starting to make obvious openings. So now let's use the rag. Hang one of the little strands of yarn on each needle that you need to place into work. Use either your fingers or a tool. Here I'm knitting a hat. I'm going to use 74 needles, so I will hang 74 of the little strands of yarn. You can start in the middle of the needle span and work outward, or you can work from end to end. One of the reasons for using a cast-on rag is clearly on display here and now. This new-to-me machine has a worn-out sponge strip. I'm just in the act of trying it out. With this particular one, there's no risk of a jam, but you can see the needles are getting away from me, and I can't cast on in any ordinary way. Once we get the strip hung, knit in a row of ravel cord from left to right. Then you can cast on using any method you want or leave the stitches open for finishing later. And that is another reason to use a cast-on rag. If you want to keep your options open or you want to rehang the work later to do some sort of fancy trim into the open stitches. Sometimes you need a rag because it's very difficult to cast on with the main yarn. Fuzzy, slubby, furry yarns can be like that. The rag also gives us a place to hang weights if we need them in order for the first row to knit well. It's very difficult to hang weights evenly across the cast-on if you need a substantial amount. The rag also means that your weights need not necessarily match the gauge of your machine. These bar weights are from another machine, but they hang fine in the rag. A cast-on rag made of sturdy yarn can last a very long time and save a lot of use of waste yarn. Here's a little bit of a closer look. 10 stitches are hung. The ravel cord is being knitted in left to right. And for ravel cord here, I'm simply using leftover bit of thin yarn. You can see it's been knitted before. Threading the main yarn into place. In this case, I'm going to leave open stitches, but I might be casting on in another case. Knitting a few rows of main knitting. Normally you would bind off after that or scrap off, but I'm just going to show you the edge that we've created. The blue is the cast-on rag. We'll save that to reuse. The white is the ravel cord. We'll pull that out eventually. But first we would normally put some kind of a finished edge on here, working into the stitches as you see me doing. Gathering them would be just as you see. We'd run a yarn needle with yarn in it as a running stitch through those stitches. Often we might backstitch through them or chain stitch into them. When we pull out the ravel cord, we'll be left with whatever edge we created. In my case, plain open stitches, but maybe your finished edge. And the rag to reuse.